So this last segment, before we go and have drinks and really talk about stuff, is sort of a no-holds-barred look into the future with some great people, half of whom I've worked with at one point or another. Mike Reed, Managing Director from RBC, please come on up. Stuart Cummins, Head of Wealth Front Office, T. Co. worked with briefly. Come on up. Richard Charnock, I saw you earlier. Are you still here? Yes, brilliant. CEO for Standard Life Wealth, come on up. And I saw Liz come in. Yes. So Liz and I actually haven't met before, I think, but I've held you in high esteem from afar. I'm glad you're finally able to join us. All joining Richard for this sort of final session. Thank you. Liz, any open seat. And this will be your final chance to have sort of active engagement. If you look at the title of this, it's very much sort of a bit blue sky. It's tying in any of the themes that have come up today as well as things that haven't, looking not just in the immediate future but out quite a long ways. What do we think might happen? Left field events, etc. So this is the opportunity to sort of test your creativity and stump the panel, as it were. I'll start out with two of the questions that were sort of in the prepared ones so that people might have had a chance to think about this as you sort of get your juices flowing again. The first is a third down on the list. So do firms have the requisite agility to respond to changes on the horizon? We've heard about so much today and processes and possible and risks and so forth, but are firms actually agile enough to actually make these kind of changes based on what's happening in the future? Who would like to kick us off?
I'll go, George.
Brilliant.
If you
Thank
want.
you. Thanks, Chris.
So, I mean, my view is really interesting when you come to these conferences and you talk about digital and technology, and I think everybody in the audience is thinking, of course that's where we want to go, of course that's what we want. But the really hard bit is execution. It's actually getting this stuff done. I mean, we're in an environment where we've not got enough money to keep legacy systems going and compliant. We've got technology teams that aren't as good, perhaps, at understanding how we can change the client experience. And you have lots of excuses that get in the way of us getting there. The regulator won't like it, our compliance team won't like it, our legal team won't like it. So I think as an industry, it's easy to come to these conferences. Quite often I've sat in the audience and thinking, of course that's where we want to go, but actually how do we execute? And I think a lot of it is because we sit there and talk about why we can't get there, and less time thinking about how can we change the way we run projects? How can we change the mix of our leadership capability in the organizations? How can we make sure it's not the technology guy sat in the room with Microsoft, it's the people that sit in front of customers and clients? How can we make that a more agile organization? So I mean, my view is, as an industry, we're slow.
Right.
I mean, I would agree with that as well. And I think it's always a good idea to look at your core business, look at what's going on in the industry, and pick and choose and see what you think you can make work in a realistic time frame. It's interesting because at the moment we're in the process of implementing a new system, which is always a challenge, and it's a challenge to keep business as usual going as long as, along with implementing the new system. And I think it's key, like you say, Stuart, in terms of getting the people that are going to be using it, getting them engaged early, getting them actually involved in the decision process as to which system to go with, so that you've got that buy-in and the rollout then becomes a lot easier. I think that's always a good thing to bear in mind.
Yeah.
Well, we had a different Rob Taylor here this morning.
Yes, we did.
Let's start there. Okay, so we're in Chatham House Rule, aren't we?
No longer. So everything you say is going to be published tomorrow.
Oh, right, brilliant. So I'm not going to say anything. So I've heard Rob speak in the last 2 weeks, where his biggest concern about this industry, about this sector, about wealth management, about private banking, is the sustainability of the sector on a commercial basis. Okay, so if you look at the cost-income ratios, typically 80, 90%, 100 plus in some cases. And he's challenging us to come up with different ways to run our business so that we're operationally more efficient and we become more commercial, because he doesn't want to be presiding over a sector where there are forced mergers and takeovers. And there is a genuine concern about that at Canary Wharf. So are we agile enough to embrace change, to deliver some of the improvements that are needed to make our businesses more scalable, to make them more operationally efficient? And I would say it's very patchy. It's the usual thing. I mean, the complement of private clients, wealth management, private banks, investment houses is so broad, and it ranges from boutiques all the way up to Goldman's, that there is, of course, a different capability under that heading. But in the eyes of the regulator, there's not enough understanding of future operating models, making ourselves more profitable, and focusing on the wiring as much as the digitalisation of the customer experience. So I would just say, and we may want to get it out on this panel, we've talked a lot about digital today through a customer lens. We need to think about it through the lens of making ourselves more effective as businesses.
Effective, including profitability, presumably. Yes.
Exactly.
Mike?
I could just tell a story of, we got a new CEO who came in about a year ago, Dave Mackay, and he came to speak to us last week, and he said that he's very much technology oriented. He thinks that we may need to make a big move. And we're one of the biggest banks in the world, so that's really hard for a big bank to say that. What he did is, and I know everyone's on these innovation labs and incubators and everything else, but he actually gave a project to our local university that created BlackBerry. Sorry about that, everyone. But they created BlackBerry and said, build us a bank. You've got a year. And so 10 people in a year did all the research and came up with an online bank. And he said that if, Dave said that if we had put this to our IT people, they probably would have asked for 2,000 people and it would have taken them 3 years. So I think it's all about tone from the top. Are people really committed to this? And how do you actually think outside the box and say, well, this could run separately to, you know, the normal bank that we have? You don't have to have everything integrated and completely united.
Interesting. Did you want to add that?
Well, I go around the world and I deal with all sorts of different banks, and I sit in workshops and go through all of this, and I would agree with you, the agility is not there, and it is largely down to the people and the culture and the legacy technology. Where I see it succeeding, of course, there's the easier examples. It's greenfield. They started with the cloud. They started with the customer journeys. You know, all the rest of it. That's easy. Where you see the more interesting examples is where they've really sort of said, well, let's wrap up some of this, you know, legacy in the short term, and expose that through APIs. This thing called the API economy. And plug into maybe the best of the market, the fintechs, for example, but it doesn't have to be that. And therefore, we can sort of outsource our innovation a little bit. We can control what we've currently got to, you know, we've got to hang on to, and then we can kind of crawl our way out of it. Now, that's slow, but it's usually palatable to most boards. Really, though, your best acceleration, and I heard it yesterday from the guy that sort of set up a lot of the technology for Metro Bank. He said, I set it up at Barclays. I'd rip it up, I'd go straight to the cloud and start clean if I possibly could.
So can I just come back on your point about APIs? Because I run a £7 billion business within a £350 billion business. So I've got the mothership controlling the project in the subsidiary, if you like. And of course, as you change the architecture and you build your core book of record and then try and connect these other components around it, everybody will tell you it's all API enabled. You know, and to me, as the layperson, I'm just looking at a few people down here who tell me this stuff. It's like taking a RAM pin plug and putting it in a RAM pin socket. But when you try and do it, it just does not work like that. And that is one of the impediments in the industry, because we are trying to flex our architecture, but it's very hard to connect it all together.
Yeah.
So you go from APIs to CSVs and they don't work, and it's all very complicated.
Well, if you do point to point, which is what most people are doing, you know, this API to that API to the other API, then it's not going to work. You do need a bit of a sort of an enterprise service bus, which is kind of old technology, but you need that kind of central motorway, and then you go outside.
Just push back a little bit, or maybe go a little deeper. So, Mike, I'll start with you, because we've got a shared history. What you were just describing with RBC is innovative. What Jamie earlier in the day was describing with Smart Wealth is innovative, but they feel like they're small projects in big organizations. Is that enough to be a substitute for really being agile? Is that enough, really? Or is that just a start?
I think it's just a start. If I could, the biggest threat, because I know this is one of the things that a lot of people are talking about, the biggest threat that I feel to us in this room as wealth managers, it's not, and I'm going to do this backwards for your benefit, it's not the mass affluent emerging wealth who will probably stick with their bank or go to a robo-advisor. We're in the middle where, say, it's 10 to 30 million, and we can deal with these people really well. It's the upper end. And our biggest threat is not the robo, it's the multifamily office and the single family office, because they control the ecosystem. And this is where I'm getting to the nimble side. So think of the proposition of you can go to and use any bank you want. And quite frankly, they don't want to be banks, so they're going to use the best of the banks. So you can't say safety and stability and everything else and size is an issue, because quite frankly, they can use it. They'll just go to whoever they choose. They have access to things like direct investments, private equity, which big banks have a really hard time because of compliance, suitability, appropriateness. They have less regulatory issues, right? They can change very easily for the client, so the client actually doesn't have to have a lot to do in that manner. And guess what? It probably costs about the same, because quite frankly, they have the economies of scale with the banks to say, well, we're going to negotiate your price down because we're taking the advisory responsibility. So to the client, it looks like it's the exact same price. If you were a family office and you had, or sorry, a client who had 30 to 100 million, would you choose that, or would you choose, you know, and not to pick anyone in particular, but UBS, RBC, and Credit Suisse, and deal with them all on your own, right? So I think that multifamily office to our business is a massive threat, and that's where they can be more nimble than we can be.
Interesting. Yeah. Liz, you were nodding in agreement. Is that resonating with you? I can see.
Yes, it is, definitely. No, I think that's a fair challenge and a fair point, and I think they are able to be nimble because they haven't got a lot of the other issues and costs, etc., that you know, a full service private bank would have, for example. So,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. I'll quickly check the audience. I would love for you guys to continue to participate if you are interested, since it's kind of a blue sky, open-ended session. If there's anyone out there that has the temerity to challenge with a question? No. I want to.
I would just echo what I just heard in that, as far as Ben from Microsoft's touched with one of the implementation partners, and I would just echo exactly what you just said, in that we are seeing a lot of family office, multi-family office firms with that agility, with private equity backing, who are able to deploy new systems pretty rapidly, and that's quite a lot of the work that we're doing.
Oh, and by the way, they can do consolidated reporting, right? So all these middle office programs that are coming up, it all feeds in, right? We're not going to feed in other people. Well, anyway.
George, just to add, I mean, there's been lots of talk about technology and that being a differentiator and the way the world is going, and that's what clients demand. But what we have to do is realise that the biggest competitive advantage that any firm has, whether it's a multifamily office, a large bank, a small bank, is the power of being human. And you know, there is this slight rush away from the importance of that human connection. And the reason multifamily offices are growing in stature is because some of the best people are choosing to work there. Mm. And the reason they're choosing to work there is because they can be themselves. They can be the advisor that they want to be. And the industry overall, you know, I'm not particularly holding out big banks or small banks, has been absolutely refocusing the type of clients you can take on, the jurisdictions that you can work with, the type of advice you can give. So the higher you go up the wealth spectrum, the more those human relationships count. And nobody will set up a multifamily office from scratch. Yeah. They always go with relationships. So it's, you know, let's recognize that being human and the power of people in our industry in 50 years or 100 years will remain the differentiator. Technology is simply a platform to remove friction and paperwork and signatures and data collection. And we're no longer in the investment management business. We have to be clear about that. If you're a leader in this industry, it's about data and relationships. We're good at relationships, we're terrible at data. You know, the way we manage data in this industry is terrible. And I think that's, as a leader, you have to realize that that's the shift now. That's what you have to get better at.
Right. Richard, you want to?
Yeah, just a very brief point. That is all true. There's one thing you also need to be good at, I think, is giving advice. Now, I'm talking about it through a UK lens. I do appreciate that. But we've talked about it today. What's the fastest growing private client business in the UK? St James's Place, absolute quality business. I imagine the systems are not the freshest, and nor has it got any banking capability. But what it has is supremely brilliant advice capability and that relationship skill that you talk about. So what I think we have to get our heads around is the democratization of wealth in a different way. The democratization of wealth, to me, is that the responsibility for long-term savings is passed back to the individual. This is not how we see it through a private banking lens. This is how the government sees it. So the strain for longevity and for long-term savings and pensions move to that individual. They're not with the employer and they're not with the state. So you need organisations that can respond to that challenge, provide that service, and the gateway for all of that is advice. And St James's Place are doing it better than anybody else, which is why flow of money in the UK is going there faster than it is to the private banks, is to many of the other private client houses. So I think we just have to recognise that there's a lot of other building blocks beyond this digital piece, and having good individuals is that expertise that you also need to be able to deploy.
And I appreciate it's retail banking, and it may not seem relevant, but if you look at Metro Bank, people kind of go, what on earth are they doing? They're building stores. They are putting it all about the people, and they're hiring people for the human touch. But they've got great processes behind them. So I totally agree with you. It is that human touch, but it's giving them the digital superpower to be better and quicker and faster than their competitors.
Well, they got dog biscuits.
That does help.
Most importantly.
And the
24
dog
by
tweets.
7.
Have you read the dog's tweets? They're brilliant.
Mike, I want to pick up on part of what you were talking about in terms of threats.
Yes.
You were talking about the family offices, and maybe expand the term to risks more broadly. Again, one of the prepared questions that you guys might have looked at ahead of time, which global risks pose the greatest hazard to the wealth management industry? You can think of that not just in terms of your firm, but the broader industry, and not just in terms of competitor threats, but risks more broadly. What are the big risks that the industry faces?
Well, I was just at Step Asia, and one of the presenters was really good, and he came up and he tried to describe how China, who's one of the largest populations in the world, how the whole one-child policy, so demographics I think is a risk, because that one-child policy, so the two parents are now 70-something years old, so there's two sets of parents, they've had one child each, they get married, so that wealth is now concentrated in two people. They get married, they're 40 years old, whatever, they've had a child. Now all of that money, so all of this wealth is trickling down to one person who probably doesn't like the advisor that they've been working with, right? That's the trend, and that's the studies say that generally as the generations pass, they'll change advisors. So our biggest threat, and I'm not saying that China is a prime example, but it illustrates very, very well that this money can all be concentrated with people that we don't have our relationships with yet. And that's why we've put a lot of focus on the next generation and how do you connect with them. And that's actually where I think digital really plays in, because it's going to be mandatory versus a nice to have.
Yep. I think globally we face a trust challenge. This is an industry that's privatised its profits and socialised its losses. I'm not the first person to say that. We've done it all around the globe. And we're having to recover trust. And whilst the banks are doing that, the asset managers are beginning to gain traction. And the asset managers and the investment houses and the insurers around the world are coming into the space that we as bankers have been occupying historically. So I do see that as a very big threat and a global theme, as is product. So sell side, product availability, banks have deleveraged, there's far less of it. And what is it that we are going to do as an industry to respond to the lower for longer return environment that we have to operate in? What is it that we can provide? Go back to my point earlier about democratisation of wealth, long-term savings, decumulation. What is it in decumulation that the industry is innovating around that meets the needs of people that are living longer? I see that as one of our biggest threats, because as the generations move on, the next one's coming to us for a solution. And I speak as an insurer that has a big annuity book. We haven't found it yet. We still haven't cracked that one. So we need to provide something along the lines, actually, the lady from the CEO of Santander was talking about earlier, private markets, so infrastructure and global credit and private equity, real estate. We need to be thinking about illiquid but long-term yielding solutions to respond to this challenge, because I think it's a big threat. Otherwise, what's the point of the industry if it can't meet that need?
George, I just had probably two others. I think at a society level, we've got a situation where the gap between the richest and the poorest is growing, and I think that worries our clients. And I think that although they're beneficiaries from this and sort of free market economy, it's a big challenge, I think, for the world, and I do see that as a big risk. And then also this move between globalization to nationalization. And for us as potentially providers of wealth management services on a global basis, for some people in the room, that in some ways that's a benefit, because it means Google Wealth can't come in and cane the world. But we are now dealing with national regulators in the national interest, and how does that work? And can you really get scale? Is there such a thing as a global wealth manager anymore? I'm not so sure about that. So I just picked those two.
Right.
I think I would sort of add, it may be difficult, a leap here, but if you look at Microsoft, it was a company that was kind of struggling with all of these kind of questions in its own context. The product, the culture, the value, what people perceived on it, its future, and so on and so forth. And the journey that we've gone through and sort of come out the other side in terms of transforming all of that with a new leader, a new culture, new products, etc., reflected in a share price and a sentiment. So it's not just my opinion. But that journey, that change is really, really hard to go through. So I think the change process is another threat to this industry. And I guess what I would say is that having gone through it a little bit, we can perhaps assist, but don't underestimate that challenge of change.
Yeah, I would agree.
Interesting. Anything else on risks, voice? Let's end on a high note. Let's end on a positive note. Oh, sorry. Is there a question? Yeah, sorry. Hey, brilliant. Thought that might.
Is this a drinks order going in?
Maybe this is the high note you wanted. It's Paul Emery, St James's Place.
Didn't even
I'm interested to know
How'd you do it?
if you were forced to make an investment in somebody in our sector or a particular subsector within our industry, and forced to hold out for the next 10 years, where would you be putting your money at the moment, aside from your own business, perhaps?
All right, let's turn the camera back off. Yeah.
I would say, I'll go first. So I would invest in Cazenove Capital Management, which is, funnily enough, where we're going in February. So, there's a bonus there for everyone.
Brilliant.
I think if the vertically integrated models, Schroders, CAS, Standard Life, SJP, stay the right side of the regulator, and they will do, because they will reconfigure themselves accordingly, then I would choose those three. Old Mutual, another one. Did I say that? No, I didn't. Because they've got all that componentry, they can leverage it in an appropriate way. They can drive their flows, they can drive their margin, and they've got deep pockets, so they can innovate. So I would take any of the VI models in the UK.
Anyone else with the check to write?
I'm going to it's a bit of a cop-out on this one, because I don't know that acquisitions are always the way to go. I'd invest in your own people, and I would actually kind of rethink what should a wealth manager look like, and should they be talking to people about relationships and values and things that these technology solutions can never solve. Complexity is something. Just on Uber, everyone thinks Uber is so great. It is, but if you live on the other side of Tower Bridge right now, it has no idea how to get a car from the north side to the south side, right? So there's where complexity, digital can't always solve that. So we need better wealth managers. We need better bankers, to your advice comment, right? That know how to engage and actually make the digital an add-on versus the critical point. It was a cop-out, I'm sorry. I didn't give you a name.
Good answer. Liz, you want to write a check?
Yeah, I think I'd sort of go back to basics in terms of what it is that clients are looking for. And a lot of the clients that we certainly deal with are entrepreneurial, self-made people, and they want to preserve their wealth. And a lot of them have got businesses, obviously. So I think I'd look a bit more bigger picture in terms of what other areas can enhance what we're doing on the wealth management side. So I think putting some money into the commercial side, which is what we've started to do now within Bothwell Latham, makes perfect sense, because you can't really expect an entrepreneur to separate out their business from their personal finances. They want the two are intrinsically entwined, and they want them to stay that way. So I think it's really powerful to be able to say that from under one roof, we can look at the two areas, and you don't have to repeat your story time and time again to different people. You've got that level of understanding within the one organisation, and also from a commercial point of view, there's a lot less compliance costs and risks as well associated with the commercial side of businesses. So I think that makes sense as well.
Got it. Excellent. Right. So I'm going to wrap with a different version of a final comment than we did earlier in the day. So in an unconstrained world, right? So resources unconstrained, regulatory constraints. So you take away the constraints. What would you can one thing, you can do more than one if you want to, but one thing you would change right now about your organizations, making them better in however you envision that, constraints off, what would you change? What would you do to move your organization forward in a way that you think is useful down the line?
I would reduce the dominance of the client relationship manager in the process.
Okay.
Do you want me to go?
Stuart, go ahead.
you
Okay.
go.
So I would rebalance the wealth planning skills that portfolio managers have, if that makes sense. Because I think there'll be a blurring of the lines between a portfolio manager, a relationship manager, and a wealth planner. And I think that because as investments become increasingly commoditized, wealth planning and structuring and helping clients see the future is one of the big differentiators still around.
Mike, unconstrained.
Unconstrained, I think, and we're trying to do this right now, focus on what you're really good at and where you're really good at it.
That was a message from earlier today. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're good at focusing on what we're good at. We know what our niche is, but I think it would be more around how can we increase revenues, how can we make our model more efficient, and how can we get more time in the day would be nice as well.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure how much this applies, Richard, for you, but
Oh golly, I don't know. I mean, I was at an event the other day, and we were talking about how do you make all this actually happen. And quite often, there's got to be some money at the end of this journey, right? And so we were talking about, and this is a very unconstrained answer at the end of the day.
excellent.
So we're talking about the COP agreement in Paris. That still remains after Trump. You spoke about China needing, trillions of private money to move from a brown economy to a green economy. So people then started talking about green bonds and where's the green bond market?
Yeah.
And then we sort of said, well, would I ever want to invest my personal pension into green bonds going to deliver into China? Probably not. So then they said, well, this is maybe the sort of thing that pulls blockchain through because you have this audit trail and this immutability. So maybe I want a world where people think big like that,
Right.
and then they come to me and say, can you put your money into this because potentially it looks like you can deliver some real change.
I love that. What a great way to end. Brilliant. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, first of all, for being here all the way to the end, for keeping people engaged. Thank you all for staying. Please join me in thanking.